Well, as far as human rights concerns, you have to say you have to divide the world into two groups essentially. There's a group of countries that broadly observes human rights. They're democracies. They have representative governments. That includes most of the developed countries, the United States, Western Europe, Japan, etc. But you also have a core group of developing countries like Botswana and Ghana and other countries in Asia, Latin America, that observe human rights as much as you can expect them to in certain circumstances. They're developing democracies as well as developing economies. Then you have a second group of countries, countries like Cuba, countries like China, North Korea, Burma, Sudan, Zimbabwe, Venezuela, Iran, Saudi Arabia. These are countries that deny their own citizens basic fundamental human rights, particularly in the civil and political area. But it's not sufficient that they deny them domestically. They also seek to block their promotion internationally. When you look at China, it uses its position on the Human Rights Council, but the United Nations Human Rights Council, but also in the Security Council, to try and frustrate efforts to hold oppressive states and governments, regimes to account. And this is very, very difficult for the United States and other countries which wish to promote human rights to overcome. It essentially hamstrings the international apparatus designed to try and promote these principles. No. In a word, no. What you saw from China was a bit softening in the lead up to the Olympics. People were criticizing China's hosting the Olympics, calling it the Genocide Olympics, for China's support of Sudan. But in the months and years leading up to the Olympics this year, you saw China not only block Security Council resolutions in regards to Sudan, it blocked Security Council resolutions in the situation in Zimbabwe. It prevented any kind of concerted effort to try and address the situation in Burma, which was particularly tragic because you had a cyclone hit and hundreds of thousands of people kicked out of their homes, losing their livelihoods, suffering. And China's sitting there and protecting the regime, which has no interest in trying to help those people. And it was tragic, and the Olympics led China to somewhat soften its stance. It got Sudan to agree in some part to efforts to have an international peacekeeping force in Darfur. But it certainly didn't bring full pressure to bear. And now that the Olympics are done, that one leverage point, that one means for bringing China to put some pressure on these states for their human rights practices has disappeared. And I expect China to continue to act as it has historically and be an impediment to advancing human rights rather than a country that either does not stand in the way or actually actively supports that effort. You have these political levers, like the Olympics was one. You have the naming and shaming. You can try and bring international media to bear. Situations like Darfur, situations like Burma, situations like what are in Zimbabwe, the more international scrutiny there is, the more politically difficult it is for China to stand alone in protecting these regimes. And so you have this type of pressure. Economically, it's extremely difficult for the U.S. or anybody else to put that kind of pressure on China because of the interrelationships of the economic of the two economies. The U.S. has always had a human rights plank in its foreign policy, going back to the very beginning of our country. Why does the United States exist today? It exists because the U.S. people thought that the British government was not honoring their basic rights as human beings. They were being taxed without representation. They weren't being allowed to choose their own government. So forth. They were being tried without due process, etc. That's what sparked the revolution in the United States. And so, from the very beginning of our country, we have had a human rights plank as the basis for our creation, our establishment as a country, and we've taken that plank and applied it abroad. We have always been an example of how democracy can and should work. We've always tried to promote human rights practices where we can. But that can't be the only plank in the foreign policy agenda of the United States. We have other interests as well. And you can never apply one standard universally in all cases without exception unless it's your only plank in your foreign policy agenda. And that's simply not the case for the United States. There are too many other interests involved for that to be the only priority. And so, no, the United States has not applied that principle universally, but it has applied it historically, and it's applied it in a number of cases where it may have a significant impact, significant positive impact for the people around the world. As an aspirational document, the Universal Declaration is a sound document. It lays out the kinds of rights that you would like countries to honor or observe. The right to select your own government, the protections against arbitrary detention, protections against torture, the right to a trial by your peers. You know, these form the core of what you would like countries to honor as far as the human rights practices embedded in their systems. And that has had an impact to some extent. Even when you look at what Russia did in Georgia, the invasion of Georgia, what did Russia do after that? It said that it invaded Georgia to protect the rights of Russians that were living in Georgian territory. So it felt the need to provide a human rights justification for its actions. And to that extent, the extent of embedding the concept that countries and governments must observe human rights, that has been a success. Where it has failed, and I think this is evident in the examples that you noted, Rwanda and Sudan, Zimbabwe, Burma, China, Cuba, where it has failed is in getting countries to actually observe those rights on a widespread basis. When you look at Freedom House, which is an organization that measures civil and political rights of countries around the world, a majority of the world is either partly free or not free in honoring human rights, honoring the basic civil and political standards, the rights that we in the United States take for granted. So a majority of the world is suffering under a lack or a paucity or imperfect human rights. And the Universal Declaration has not been sufficient to overcome that. What's worse is that countries like China and Cuba, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, Burma, Zimbabwe, all, the whole list of that most of the viewers can sum in for themselves. These countries have used the United Nations system, the principle of universal participation in the United Nations, to undermine the application of the Universal Declaration. When you look at the Human Rights Council, these countries actively use the Council to blunt criticism and scrutiny of human rights practices that the body is charged to look at. It has used the General Assembly to try and prevent and undermine those very principles, the human rights in the Universal Declaration. And for that reason, the United Nations itself is a pretty poor instrument for advancing human rights, and that is something that it has not received enough attention. We need to look beyond just turning to the Human Rights Council or to the United Nations when there's a human rights problem, because the UN is not very capable of overcoming that kind of built-in resistance of the membership. The Council was created to, as you say, replace the Commission on Human Rights. The Commission was deemed to be a complete and utter failure. They've been around for 50 plus years and had fallen to total disrepute as far as a champion of human rights. You mentioned that Libya was the chairman of the Commission at one point. But you also have membership by Sudan and China and Cuba, all the human rights abusers in the UN system that were using that body to protect themselves from scrutiny, but also to launch political attacks against states like Israel or the United States. The reputation of the Commission, had fallen to the point where former Secretary General Kofi Annan, UN Secretary General, stated that the Commission had cast a shadow on the reputation of the entire UN system, and so they decided to create the Council to replace it. Unfortunately, in the political maneuvering in order to get a resolution creating the Council, they dropped all of the significant membership criteria that would have prevented those countries from becoming part of the new Council. And so you see those same countries on the Council that actively undermine the Commission's agenda. And so it's no surprise that the Council is just as bad, if not worse, than the previous Commission. You essentially have old wine in new bottles, is the phrase. And so what have we seen from the Council? You've seen minor resolutions mildly criticizing Sudan for the situation in Darfur, not even criticizing the government, just remarking on the situation, mildly rebuking Burma for its crackdown on peaceful protesters and Buddhist monks. You have not seen any resolutions on China. You've not seen any resolutions on North Korea. No resolutions on Zimbabwe. No resolutions on Cuba. No resolutions on Saudi Arabia. No resolutions on Iran. No resolutions on any of the countries that you would point out as the major human rights abusers around the world. Instead, what you've seen is resolution after resolution after resolution criticizing Israel. I'm not saying that Israel is a paragon in its observance of human rights. There is no doubt that Israel deserves some criticism for its practices. But Israel is not the worst human rights situation in the world. I don't think that anybody that takes an objective look at that situation would argue that it was. Yet that's what the Council is predominantly focused on. Not only that, the Council has withdrawn its country-specific resolutions in 4 different instances. And so not only is the Council not focusing on the primary human rights problems around the world, it's actually pulling back its built-in procedures to focus on them. The U.S. isn't a perfect country in its observance of human rights. There's no doubt about that. It's received an enormous amount of criticism for the instances you mentioned, Abu Ghraib, Guantánamo, its treatment of the detainees in Guantánamo. But that's kind of an illustration of what I'm talking about. The U.S. is head and shoulders above other countries in the world in terms of its observance and honor of the principles of human rights. The treatment of its soldiers who were responsible for Abu Ghraib, they were tried, they were punished, they were held to account. The U.S. went through a judicial process to try and determine what it should do with Guantanamo. And that process ended up with a result that was against the policy of the administration. And so in the U.S., the system processed it, it worked, and we abide by the result of that. This is actually how it's supposed to work. Too many countries in the world don't have anything resembling that. They don't have anything resembling that. Instead, people wallow with a total oppression, with a total lack of observance of human rights. They are arbitrarily detained. They have no recourse. They are killed. They have no champions. They are repressed, and there's nobody there to talk or report about it. The government is totally without any kind of accountability. And yet these are the countries that feel free in the United Nations system to criticize the United States. And I'm not saying we're above criticism, but we should be having that criticism be applied evenly, and we're not. Worse, you have efforts by countries like the Organization of the Islamic Conference, who are putting forward this principle of a defamation of religions resolution, which would make free speech subservient to the possible offense of religious belief. And the case here is where a number of cartoonists in Denmark, they made cartoons portraying Islamic terrorism, the Prophet Muhammad, and these were deemed offensive. And so the genesis behind the defamation of religious resolution would try and make it illegal for this type of thing to occur. Now, you may disagree with the illustrations, you may disagree with the cartoons, you may disagree with anybody that takes an extremist view criticizing another religion. But should that be against the law? I don't think so. I don't think anybody that really honors freedom of speech or freedom of expression would take that view. Yet that is exactly what the Organization of the Islamic Conference is trying to do, and to some degree has succeeded in doing through the Human Rights Council and the United Nations General Assembly. And that is a direct, not just a glancing, but a direct blow against the Universal Declaration. In principle, we do need, whether it's a informal or a formal organization of democracies trying to promote human rights. And Democracies is is maybe too loose a term. We need, or too narrow a term. We need countries that are dedicated to promoting human rights, fundamental human rights, civil and political rights. By and large, those countries are representative governments, democracies, republics, elected governments. But that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. The idea is that you need a group of countries that are committed to promoting civil and political rights and working together internationally to try and promote those principles. The reason why you need this group is because the Organization of the Islamic Conference, which is a group of Middle Eastern Islamic states, the Group of 77, which is a group of 130 plus developing countries, the Non-Aligned Movement, which is another grouping within the United Nations, they all do band together to try and prevent scrutiny and criticism of human rights practices of their members. And so you need a counterbalancing grouping to either break apart those voting blocks or to counterweight those voting blocks if you're going to be successful in these international fora. And so I think we do need that. I think we should try and work as much as we can to achieve it. And if we can, I think you're going to see some progress on promoting fundamental human rights abroad. Without it, I think we're stuck in this sort of disappointing status quo.